This video is sponsored by Tokyo Treat and Sakura Co. So there's a topic we've touched on a couple of times in a bunch of my videos, a topic that comes up a lot in the later stages of Naruto, a topic that every fledgling Naruto fan holds on to as a possibility to fix any problem regardless of how grave it is. And here's the thing, those fans are not wrong for holding on to the hope that this ability might get used because this ability gives you almost limitless power. The ability that I'm talking about is, of course, Edo Tensei, also known as summoning impure world reincarnation. But Edo Tensei sounds way cooler, but not nearly as cool as liking this video, subscribing to the page, and hitting that noti bell, and definitely not as cool as going as far as to hit that join button and becoming a member of the Weeb Alliance over here on YouTube, getting additional content from me in the form of 3 additional videos a month. But before we get into all that, guys, today we gotta talk about our favorite returning sponsor, Tokyo Treat and Sakura Co. Let's start with the big box, Tokyo Treat. Tokyo Treat is a monthly snack box filled with up to 20 exclusive to Japan in limited edition snacks. These snacks are also seasonally flavored. This month's theme is Sakura, and not like Sasuke's wife, like the pink flower. And you might be thinking,
Opening this box is kind of intimidating if you don't speak Japanese.
and if you're like me, you probably don't know what this bag says. That's why they send a 24-page pamphlet with every single box. And this pamphlet will tell you everything from what the snack is, to the allergens that are inside of it, to what its significance is in Japan. But enough talking, let's try it. So from the pamphlet, I learned these are latte marshmallows, but I'm sure they can be enjoyed without the coffee. Down the hatch. Oh yeah, they're good without the coffee. They're light and fluffy, and the taste of Sakura is subtle but sweet. But since we're talking about Sakura, let's get into our second box, Sakura Co. This month's theme for Sakura Co is matcha and mochi. And the way that Sakura Co differs from Tokyo Treat is that these are handmade, traditional Japanese snacks made by artisans. And every month they send you a different piece of kitchenware. This month was chopsticks. But where Sakura Co is very similar to Tokyo Treat is the 24-page pamphlet. And that's helpful because I don't know what this is. But thanks to the pamphlet, I now know that these are matcha cream daifuku. Let's try them. Somehow it's still incredibly fresh, and it's bitter and sweet simultaneously. So what are you guys waiting for? Become a global snacker like me. Use the code NCHammer04 at checkout for $5 off your first order. But don't just go searching up Sakura Co or Tokyo Treat. Guys, make sure you use the links that are both in my description and my pinned comment. Let's get to snacking. So Edo Tensei, what is it? How does it happen? How do you control the people you bring back? How is it countered? And more importantly, why was it created? All these questions and more will be answered right now, because I'll tell you right now, this will be the longest Jutsu explained video I've ever created. Edo Tensei is not simple, and I'm not talking about the practicality of pulling it off. No, I'm talking about the laws and rules that go into it. But before we get into the legal script, let's go back to that all-important question. Why was it created? Edo Tensei was created by Tobirama Senju, Hashirama's little brother and the second Hokage. We also know when it was created, during the Warring States period. We know it was created during the Warring States period because this is when Tobirama was active in his creation of jutsus. That's when he also created Flying Raijin. We also know it was created then because he forbid Edo Tensei and made it a kinjutsu, or a forbidden jutsu, once Konoha was formed. This is because once Konoha was formed, there was peace between the Uchiha and the Senju, and in this era of peace, Tobirama gleaned that Edo Tensei would not be necessary. But knowing when Edo Tensei was created actually gives us a bit of insight into why it was created. The most glaringly obvious reason would be that Tobirama wanted to find a way to bring his brothers back to life, specifically Itama and Kurawama Senju. And this would make sense considering the fact that Tobirama's entire reason for helping Hashirama create Konoha is to make sure that children would no longer die in wars. So if Tobirama could find a way to bring the children who had already died in wars back, then all of the past sins would be absolved. But I think his reasoning is actually deeper than that, and it has to do with something that I just said, absolving past sins. See, Tobirama was one of the biggest people in creating peace between the Uchiha and the Senju. In fact, when Tobirama's brother Kurarama asked how they were going to break the cycle of hate between the Uchiha and the Senju when they had all lost family members, Tobirama said that you're gonna have to be able to push those emotions down. But what if you didn't have to push those emotions down? What if instead you could simply get the people you've lost back? And yes, obviously this applies to Tobirama's brothers. Therefore, him and Hashirama would have no reason to hate the Senju. But I would go so far as to say that this also applied to the Uchiha. Tobirama himself took the life of Izuna, Madara's little brother. And maybe when he realized after he had taken somebody so close to Madara that Madara would never seek for a true and lasting peace, that he wanted to find a way to bring back Izuna. So why did Tobirama never use this jutsu? Well, the answer to that is actually somewhat obvious. He had morals. And to get into why Tobirama would have a moral dilemma with using this jutsu that he created, we have to talk about how the jutsu works. Tobirama was trying to find a way to take souls out of the Pure Land and return them to Earth. Pure Land is Naruto canonical heaven. All ninjas who die ascend there. But the only problem is these souls need a vessel that ties them to the earth. And I know what you're saying,
Well, why can't you just use the body of your friend who just died?
and while that would be lovely, unfortunately the vessel has to be alive. Soul can't inhabit a dead body. The body is already gone. And I'm assuming Tobirama figured this out. More likely than not, Tobirama tried to pull the soul from the Pure Land and was successful in reaching the Pure Land and extracting said soul, but he tried to put it in a dead body or the body of the person who the soul belonged to. And this most likely didn't work or had terrifying results. Tobirama, then being incredibly intelligent, probably realized that he needed a living vessel to act as the anchor to Earth. And since Tobirama created this jutsu, at least in my head canon, to break the cycle of hate, if he had to take another life to bring a life back, you're just recreating the cycle. And this is why we don't see him bring his brothers back in a fight against Madara or something like that. But what's weird is that other people, specifically Mu, the second Tsuchikage, knew that Tobirama created this jutsu. We know this because the second Mizukage and the second Tsuchikage talk about how they've been brought back with Edo Tensei, and therefore it was Tobirama's doing, which means that his research on this jutsu had to be relatively public knowledge. So it's also maybe a possibility that he did use this jutsu, though we've never seen it. But let's get back to how this jutsu works. In order to reincarnate somebody, you need a piece of their DNA. And this doesn't have to be a whole hand, it could be a fingernail, it could be hair, it could be saliva. Hell, Kabuto says that he could probably take blood off of Nagato's chakra rods that he used to kill Jiraiya in order to bring Jiraiya back. Though more often than not, people who want to use Edo Tensei end up grave robbing the people they want to bring back, which makes it all the more baffling that we do not protect the graves of important people better. Hashirama cells are sold at half priced in Costco. Let's say you have now acquired DNA of somebody you want to bring back and you have a living vessel. There's one problem. The soul you're trying to grab has to exist in the Pure Land. Edo Tensei is not perfect. It's essentially a bridge from the earth to heaven. So should your soul have not made it to heaven, let's say it's in the Shinigami's stomach because you used Reaper Death Seal to pull somebody into limbo and fight them for eternity, like Hiruzen and Minato. The bridge does not go to the Shinigami's stomach, so they cannot be brought back. The same can be said for Nagato's King of Hell. Should your soul be residing in said King of Hell, you will not be able to be brought back. Okay, so now let's say you have a living sacrifice, the DNA of the person you want to reincarnate, and their soul is in the Pure Land. There's a special scroll that initiates the transfer from the Pure Land to that vessel. And on this special scroll, you have to smear the DNA of the person who you are trying to reincarnate. It's at this point that a seal appears on the ground with the living vessel being at the center of the seal. And at this point, dust and ash from the surrounding area encapsulate the body, essentially kind of reforming the body. Because humans, as carbon-based life forms, can essentially just have carbon from the surrounding areas terraform their body into the body of the previous person. Except it doesn't really work like that. Instead, the living vessel kind of acts as a caloric output, a burning energy in order to comprise all of this dust and ash together. And it's at that point that the dust and the ash becomes the entire body. That's right, with this kind of thing, you would assume that there would be a thin dust and ash layer over the living vessel's body, but that's not the case because we've seen Edo Tensei people get split in half and there's no meaty center. And if you think about it, that actually makes a lot of sense if you consider what I'm about to tell you. You see, this whole process of getting turned into dust and ash is incredibly painful for the living vessel. Surprise. But what the true surprise is that the chakra signature of the person you're reincarnating completely takes over the living vessel's chakra signature. And what's even more surprising than that is that technically the living vessel is still alive. Though your chakra signature and body are basically entirely gone until Edo Tensei has been released, the living vessel is inside of that body. And what's even more confusing is that when Edo Tensei is released, the living vessel body reappears amongst a pile of dust and ash. So a bit like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, the body will entirely emulsify and then recreate itself over the duration of Edo Tensei. Which is good, because imagine what it would look like if Minato had lost his arms and then the living vessel's blood was just squirting out. Personally, I think they should have done that to make you understand how truly metal Edo Tensei is, but it's a children's show. But here's the thing, Edo Tensei wasn't always as perfect as it was when we saw it in the war. Tobirama himself said that when he used the techniques, the souls he brought back were much weaker than they were in their lifetime, and also he could only control a couple at a time, which I guess pretty much all but confirms that Tobirama did in fact use this jutsu. Listen, maybe he made it for a good purpose and then he realized, yeah, this could be helpful on the war front. He wasn't a perfect person, but just like with a lot of Tobirama's jutsu, people would take the jutsu and run with it down the line. Minato perfected Flying Raijin, Naruto perfected Shadow Clone, Orochimaru and Kabuto perfected Edo Tensei, but they did it separately. Orochimaru stumbled upon this kinjutsu decades after Tobirama's death, and through a lot of trial and error and a lot of research, he was able to bring the souls close to their original power levels. I say close to their original powers because when we see Orochimaru use Edo Tensei to bring both Tobirama and Hashirama back to life, if they were at full power, Hiruzen wouldn't have been around very long. That being said, Hiruzen did use the old Hail Mary and use Reaper Death Seal on all three of them. Orochimaru also, like Tobirama, didn't have perfect control over the people he brought back. Enter Kabuto. Kabuto was able to make sure that everybody he brought back was just as powerful as they were in their lifetime. He was also able to control as many people as he needed to at a time. This is because Edo Tensei technically takes no chakra to use. You heard me correctly. The summoner of Edo Tensei has to use absolutely no chakra to control those who they have summoned. So, resources permitting, you can infinitely summon people. By resources, I mean living vessels and DNA. Having these improvements allow him to essentially reincarnate an immortal army of the strongest ninjas on Earth, made Kabuto say that this is probably the strongest jutsu ever made, and he's not wrong. There's also the fact that these reincarnations can be summoned literally anywhere, because I'll remind you, they're a summoning. So you can pull the soul out of the Pure Land, slap it into a living vessel, and then put that person in a coffin and summon them whenever you need them. Tobirama and Hashirama, when they were summoned to fight against Hiruzen, had already been pulled out of the Pure Land for a long time. Their body sits in a kind of stasis limbo in the living vessel inside of that coffin, and they can be sent back to their coffin by summoning the coffin and just throwing them back in it. But how do you control some of the strongest ninjas on Earth? Well, back in Tobirama's day, simply summoning these souls allowed you to control the movements of the living vessel they encapsulate. You could restrict their movement or make them attack other people. You can even shut them down and throw them back in their coffin. And this is because they were coming back weaker than they were when they were alive. But what happens when you perfect this jutsu and now you're dealing with Hashirama or Madara at their highest level of strength? Well, that's where the problems arise, because these incredibly strong ninja can hypothetically resist the control of Edo Tensei. In fact, Tobirama was able to fight against the summoning of Orochimaru until Orochimaru got his favorite little ingredient to make anything stronger, Hashirama's cells. Through an inexplicable mean, Orochimaru used the Hashirama cell to increase the strength of the binding that he had over those people who he brought back with Edo Tensei. And while this was enough to stabilize Tobirama, Orochimaru admitted that Hashirama could still break free if he wanted to. I shouldn't have said unknown means. There actually is a known mean as to how Orochimaru was able to get Hashirama's cells into his Edo Tensei people. The use of a talisman, usually connected to a kunai, that Orochimaru and Kabuto would stick into the brains of the people that they Edo Tensei'd back. Now, this seal came in varying strengths. Before Orochimaru found a way to bind Hashirama's cells to it in order to increase its strength, the seal would allow those who were brought back to retain gain their personality. They can approach any task that their summoner tells them to do in whatever way that they would usually do it, so long as they do it. And while this may seem like a loose kind of control, it's actually very powerful, because by not fully taking over the psyche of the person you brought back, they can fight in the way that they have always fought. They know how to use their abilities better than anyone. And should hypothetically the circumstance arise where the person you've brought back is fighting somebody they once knew, by having their personality intact, it's kind of psychological warfare. That being said, the big downside with this is that technically the person you've summoned can undermine you even though they are doing the thing you want them to do. Gengetsu, the second Mizukage, is a perfect example of this. While he was tasked to destroy the 4th Squadron, the one that Gaara was leading, he was telling everybody which clans to not attack. He was telling everybody about his techniques and how best to counter them. And while he was technically still committing an act of war against the allied shinobi forces, this was his plan to undermine the person who summoned him. And while this may seem like a huge disadvantage, it's actually not, because they're still technically listening to you, and this is the level of control Kabuto prefers. And the reason that Kabuto prefers this level of control is because technically all he has to do in this circumstance is direct his army in a direction, and they will take care of everything else. The level of control Orochimaru prefers, however, is the complete erasure of all personality. In this circumstance, the summoner controls all actions of the summon. They essentially just become avatars that the summoner can channel his will through. And while this is still very effective and you will never have any of your summoned rally against you, it's not as powerful in the grand scheme because it requires a massive amount of attention from the summoner. But with this level of control, you can use these summoned to speak through or have them summon other people to summon. And Kabuto actually writes on most of his seals a kind of backdoor switch to activate this level of control should the person get too unruly. But that brings us back to the topic of control. We've already stated that Orochimaru added Hashirama's cells to these seals in order to strengthen their power. But how does Kabuto strengthen this power? Well, Kabuto funnels power from Anko's curse mark. Essentially, he uses Senjutsu chakra, making his reincarnations almost a sage move. And the only true drawback to any of this is the fact that there's going to be a physical line of chakra always between the summoned and the summoner, which allows sensor type ninjas to draw a line to where the summoner is. But unfortunately, killing the summoner does not stop the summon. And that brings us with a perfect segue into our next topic, rules. We've talked about how and why Edo Tensei was created, and we've even talked about how it works, but we haven't talked about the rules that are around it. And there is a lot of rules around it. And the misconception of these rules leads to a lot of the questions that I get asked on a daily basis. So buckle in, get your notepad out, and I'll answer a couple of the questions that everybody has about Edo Tensei here. So when you summon somebody into their living vessel, their body is all gray and cracked and gross. And this is the case for literally everyone who's been summoned. But the summoner, when they put in the talisman, can choose whether or not they want to rejuvenate the body of the summoned, i.e. restore their appearance to what they used to look like. There's literally no benefit to rejuvenating them outside of they look like they used to. The only true difference in appearances amongst those who have been Edo Tensei is the pupils. Not the pupils, actually they're called the sclerae, the thing around your pupil. Not even the thing around your pupil, it's the thing around your cornea. I'm not an ophthalmologist. But in those who have been summoned that still have their personalities, the white area, as I will be referring to it from now on, turns gray. Those with their personalities erased, it's black. A reincarnated individual will always have the Kekkei Genkai and Kekkei Toda they had in their lifetimes, along with all of the abilities they had. And yes, you are reincarnated as you were when you died. This includes any physical handicaps you had at the time of your death. That's why Nagato's legs don't work when he's reincarnated. But this seems to only pertain to physical handicaps, because illnesses that you had at the time of your death don't come with you when you're summoned. And also the things things that killed you will not come with you, obviously. You're not going to come with a bunch of holes. The only inconsistency here is whether or not things that have been grafted onto you will also come when you are summoned. What do I mean by that? Hanzo the salamander, when he was very young, had the poison sac of a river salamander put into his body so he would make his own poison. When he was reincarnated, he was brought back with this poison sac. However, Madara was not brought back with the Hashirama cell he had grafted onto himself. And because of that, Kabuto had to make his own for Madara. But since we're talking about Madara, let's talk about the question I get all the time with Madara. Why is he young? And what's funny is there's not a complicated answer to this. Everybody else looks like what they looked like when they died, right? But for some reason, Madara is younger than he was when he died. Or is he? I'll remind you, Madara dies twice. One, when he died in his fight against Hashirama and Tobirama. And then again when he died in his cave after grafting Hashirama cells to himself. But here's the thing. Technically, that was Hagoromo. What do I mean? Combinations of both Indra and Ashura's chakra allowed Madara to awaken the Rinnegan. The reason you awaken the Rinnegan in that situation is because when you combined Indra and Ashura's chakra, you get Hagoromo's chakra, and he had the Rinnegan. So Madara died when Hashirama killed him, but Hagoromo died when Madara died a second time. This is why Madara looks exactly like what he looks like when Hashirama killed him the first time. That is further enhanced by the fact that those who are summoned are reincarnated with the clothes they were wearing when they died. And while they're not actually clothes, they're actually just an extension of their body through the dust and ash hole thing. Still, Hashirama was wearing his traditional battle outfit he was wearing against Hashirama. And while you are spawned in with your clothes, you're not given your weapons. The 7 swordsmen of the mist are only able to use the swords that Kabuto collected. The only exception to this rule is Ginkaku and Kinkaku, because apparently they hid the Sage of Six Paths' sacred treasures within themselves. And what's even truly wilder than all of this is there's still ways to enhance Edo Tensei. The biggest benefit of Edo Tensei is that those who you bring back are technically immortal. Slice them in half, that's fine. They're made of ash and dust. They'll just re-come together. And this is actually purposely done by Tobirama, who created the Jutsu, because Tobirama wasn't bringing back legendary ninja. No, he was bringing back any ninja to use in a kamikaze-like style. Specifically, he would use these bodies to pull off mutually multiplying explosive tag jutsu. Essentially, by using the body of the summoned as a medium to create explosive tags, they can make their body an infinitely scaling series of explosions. Because as their body turns into more and more explosive tags, they also regenerate. And so they can set off an infinite series of explosions. So you don't need Madara, you just need anybody. And in the Warring States period, when it was more like a traditional battlefield where large groups of ninja would run into each other, an infinite series of explosions is gonna do a good amount of work. And considering there's no gore or anything, because those who are summoned technically don't bleed, unless they're doing a summoning technique, which is a weird caveat to me, it's just explosions. And a common misconception is that those who are reincarnated have infinite chakra. While it's technically true in a sense, they have infinitely refilling chakra, which means that their chakra can be 100, but it can be 100 as many times as they want. But if there's a jutsu that requires 110 chakra, they won't be able to do it. This is evidenced by the fact that when Mu splits his body to avoid Naruto's Rasengan, his chakra reserves are cut in half and he can no longer perform his Kaketoda. Or the fact that all people who have been summoned can't use infinite clones. Oh, I lied. They also can bleed if they use their Mangekyo Sharingan, but because they perpetually regenerate, the bleeding eyes don't make them go blind. So technically, anybody with an MS who gets summoned has EMS. So now that something this powerful exists, how on earth do we counter it? There has to be drawbacks, right? And while the list of drawbacks isn't quite as long as I would like it to be, there is some. Like I said earlier, killing the summoner does not get rid of the summon, because remember, it takes no chakra from the summoner after they've been summoned. Therefore, you kill the summoner, the summoned just exist forever. There's only 3 ways to get rid of those who have been summoned. Reaper Death Seal, Hiruzen taught us that. Having the summoner end the technique, either voluntarily or through genjutsu like Itachi did. Or the third, in much less reliable way, form an emotional connection with those who've been reincarnated and really just talk no jutsu them into going back to heaven. Essentially, you can talk to those who have been reincarnated, and if you're nice enough, they can will themselves out of the body. Obviously, you can also seal those who have been summoned and just let them chill out for a little while. Gaara does this with Grand Sand Mausoleum. Sai does it with his Tiger Scroll. Essentially, any high-level Fuin Jutsu will be able to seal a summoned person. Now, it won't release their soul from the summoning. They'll just be in your seal, but they're still not wreaking havoc. On top of this, summoned people are susceptible to yin-yang release. Since yin-yang release is essentially the creation of all things, you can manipulate souls as well with it. So something like a True Seeker Orb, if it hits a summoned person, will also destroy the soul. This is why Minato wasn't able to regenerate his arms, and even when he was released from his living vessel, we saw him return to the Pure Lands with no arms. So hypothetically, should a True Seeker Orb go through a summoned person's heart, it would kill them. And not just the living vessel and the reincarnated person, it would destroy their soul. And then there's the truly unpleasant way to get pulled out of your living vessel, the Sword of Totsuka. See, Itachi uses the Sword of Totsuka to seal Nagato. And the Sword of Totsuka essentially is a sword that if you're stabbed with it, it will put your soul in a realm called the Realm of Drunken Dreams. It's a bit like being sealed by the Shinigami, having your soul pulled into limbo. And while it's unclear as to whether or not the releasal of the summoning pulls people out of this realm of drunken dreams, we can at least partially assume that Nagato is living in a realm that is essentially like living in the dizziest you've ever been forever. It's not great. Also, technically, the use of Kodo Matsukame can overwrite the commands of the summoner in the summoned heads. Itachi does this to himself. And while the summoner can regain control of that summoned person, he has to get their talisman and then re-put it in him. And then there's the largest glaring hole with Edo Tensei that still, to this day, aggravates me deeply. If the summoned knows the hand seals to activate Edo Tensei, they can sever the contract with the summoner. And you're like, oh, cool, Tobirama put an out in there in case he ever got summoned back, so he could just send his soul back to the Pure Land. Nope. 1, for some reason, Tobirama doesn't know how to do this. 2, for some reason, Madara does. And if you sever this contract with your summoner, you just get to be immortal and have infinite chakra with nobody controlling you. Madara refers to it as the one risk of this technique. That's a very big one risk. And it's not like it's 100 hand seals. It's 5. With just trial and error, you could probably figure it out. So now there's a person running around with infinitely refilling chakra, complete regenerative ability, and nobody can tell them what to do. Also, technically, you can put Black Rod receivers in the reincarnated and control them like Nagato did with the 6 Paths of Pains. This is what Obito did with the Jinchuriki. So yeah, even though this jutsu is incredibly powerful, there is a couple very glaring issues. And that's why Madara's soul was not released when Kabuto released Edo Tensei. It is single-handedly one of the biggest ass pulls in literature. Something that could have been avoided if Madara just, I don't know, transferred his consciousness to a soldier nearby in the way Orochimaru does. But nope, he just Uno reverse carded Edo Tensei. That's all I know on it. Now you know as much as I do, so you can be as angry as me. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, guys, please, for me, like the video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you enjoyed being both entertained and educated, you know, being edutained, go ahead and hit that join button and become a member of the Weeb Alliance over here on YouTube. You'll be getting 3 additional videos from me a month on top of cool badges and emotes. You also get your name at the end of every video. Listen, I'm not saying that Edo Tensei will probably never be used again, but it's safe to assume it won't be. 1, because it is basically a glaring plot hole that could fix any problem in Naruto, and Kishimoto has kind of denied its existence in Boruto. But 2, because the only people who know how to use it are Orochimaru, who's definitely not allowed to, and Kabuto, who's too busy running an orphanage. So morally, if anybody's gonna dip their toe into it, it probably would have to be somebody from Konoha, and that's most definitely not allowed. So when people always ask me, well, why don't they just bring back Hashirama in Boruto and have him fight some of the Otsutsukis? It's a great question, but moralistically, and the fact that not enough people know the information on how to do the jutsu probably weeds that out as a choice that's not going to happen, and that's all. Bye.